What's up, good people? Thank you for coming and showing up again. Got to put my headphones on. Thank you for being here another Saturday with me as we chop it up again today. Thank you for tuning in with us on Thursdays as well for the brothers chopping it up as we have been talking about Audre Lorde. We appreciate that. It's been getting a lot of good feedback from that conversation in Sister Outsider. So we thank you for that. Continue to connect with us on Thursdays at 5 p.m., 5 until 6, and then every Saturday here at 8 p.m. as we chop up a few scriptures here. Today we're doing Romans 12, verse 1 through 2, and see where that goes. I know I said 1 through 12, but as I got into it, I only got through 2 verses. So rock with me for a few minutes and we'll see what happens. So if you got your Bibles, your apps or whatever, just grab them. So that'll be Romans 12 verses 1 through 2. And it reads as thus, and I'm reading out the ESV. So it reads, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship, or spiritual duty, or reasonable service, as the King James says, which I tend to like better on these particular verses. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that by testing you might discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Word of God, people of God. Thanks be to God. I want to just kind of entitle this. Don't really have a real dope title, but I just want to title this kind of a radical rewording or reworking of Romans 12. I'm not real keen on fooling with Paul. I have my beef with Paul. I have my thoughts about Paul. And I think Paul gets a lot of things wrong. But in these particular verses, I think Paul gets it right. So as we kind of roll through this, rock with me for a few minutes and let's see how this goes. It was James Baldwin on his first trip to the South. It brought him face to face with one of the big three, as they were called. The big three being Dr. Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, and lastly, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. While in Birmingham, Baldwin describes seeing and meeting Reverend Shuttlesworth. Listen closely as Baldwin describes the mood, the demeanor, and the temperance of Reverend Shuttlesworth. The first time I saw Reverend Shuttlesworth, for example, he came strolling across the parking lot of the motel where I was staying, his hat perched precariously between the back of his skull and the nape of his neck, alone. It was late at night and Shuttlesworth was a marked man in Birmingham. He came up into my room, and while we talked, he kept walking back and forth to the window. I finally realized that he was keeping an eye on his car, making sure that no one put a bomb in it, perhaps. As he said nothing about this, however, naturally, I could not. But I was worried about his driving home alone, and as he was leaving, I could not resist saying something to this effect. And he smiled as though I were a novice with much to learn, which was true, as though he would be glad to give me a few pointers, which indeed not much later on he did, and told me he'd be all right, and went downstairs and got into his car, switched on the motor, drove off into the soft Alabama night. There was no hint of defiance or bravado in his manner. Only when I made a halting observation concerning his safety, a shade of sorrow crossed his face, deep, impatient, dark, and then it was gone. It was the most impersonal anguish I had ever seen on a man's face. Big up, Sean. What's up? Thanks for tuning in. It was as though he was wrestling with the mighty fact that the danger in which he stood was as nothing compared to the spiritual horror which drove those who were trying to destroy him. They endangered him, but they doomed themselves. Let me read that last part again. It was as though he were wrestling with the mighty fact that the danger in which he stood was nothing compared to the spiritual horror which drove those who were trying to destroy him. They endangered him, but they doomed themselves. This passage from Baldwin's No Name in the Street captures the theme of resistance and what it means for ones to place their body on the line in the pursuit of justice. Baldwin is capturing the essence of reasonable service as he details his meeting with Reverend Shuttlesworth. Baldwin has been properly introduced to the nightmare of Southern white supremacy, and he has deduced that his prior skill set, his inner city knowledge, has been rendered useless in this terrain. Now he was in a territory absolutely hostile and exceedingly strange. Ultimately, Baldwin has come face to face with the perils of being a nonconformist and the consequences of being transformed. I believe this excerpt sets the tone for what the Apostle Paul writes in Romans 12, verses 1 through 2. In Romans 12:1, the Apostle Paul starts with an appeal and urge to the community. It is this plea of mercy and compassion where Paul begins to unpack his message, denoting it is God entering into the suffering in some form, often unbeknownst. And the Apostle Paul is admonishing that God then stands alongside of those who are willing to bear the weight of living out their truth and being authentic. Because one becomes sacrificial, a living sacrifice, the moment they stand for justice. But the Apostle Paul is clear that the presentation of one's body speaks to the intentionality of what one is willing to stand up against, resist, or die for. Think about Reverend Shuttlesworth constantly peeping out the window because he was afraid that someone might bomb his car because of the stances that he takes in Birmingham, standing up for equal housing, for equal rights, in a myriad of other things. Paul appears to mirror what Ta-Nehisi Coates describes in Between the World and Me when he writes to his young son, Samari. He says, when I was your age, 1/3 of my brain was concerned with whom I was walking to school with, our precise number, the manner of our walk, the numbers of times I smiled, whom or what I smiled at, who offered a pound and who did not. All of which is to say that I practiced the culture of the streets, a culture concerned chiefly with securing the body. The same way that Coates is mining the streets and for safety and security of his body, Paul is projecting the same claim for those rocking with God. Therefore, Coates understands clearly that to miss these cultural cues were the difference between life and death. And to miss them, as he says, you will end up in a box. Paul is making similar claims when he discusses presenting the body to God. To use Coates's words, it was essential. There were no alternatives. Although Paul doesn't use live or death language, the tenacity of his claim firmly places a burden on the lived life and presented body. Though Coates is referring to the culture of the streets when understanding how one must present their body or bodies in order to live, the result in Paul's letter is the same. One can and should not present in a fashion that emboldens fakery. So when you present you must present your body with authenticity. I remind you of Coates' projection on walking the street. It's about being real and one with your surroundings, as he was always paying attention to what was happening around him, who smiled at him, who gave him a pound. Paul also says one must present as holy. Now, this holy is based upon me rocking with the best, as the roots say. See, because I'm rocking with the best, I'm able to branch out in my little space to improvise when need be, because the best will always overshadow me. So y'all remember when Bobby Brown came back and started touring with New Edition, but they put him over in the corner and let him do his thing, and they started doing what they think. If it isn't love, y'all know how that go. But Bobby couldn't keep up because, Bobby was still, recovering from some of the mishaps, as we would call it. He was still trying to recover with his body from being on drugs. So this holy that Paul is talking about, saying, look, it covers you because you rocking with the best. Bobby Brown was rocking with the best. So let's be very clear. This is not an opportunity for you to bang out, but it is a chance for you to be creative. Because the holy is about what the Messiah did, not what you do. The holy then is about me not succumbing to the myth of evangelicalism and capitalism that says I have to capitulate to oppressive standards in order to be successful, or in this case, redeemed. The holy is the readjusting, the realigning that God appropriates when our bodies are presented. The holy is not just me being sinless or sin-free. It is about being disconnected from the apparatus that produces the sin in the first place. Let me explain. It's hard to blame a person for stealing when we have a system that is so corrupt. So if a person has a blemish on their record from 15 years ago, they cannot get a job. There's something wrong when good people are held accountable for surviving in a corrupt system. Ultimately, the people don't need reform, the system does. And here, the Apostle Paul is adamantly expressing the need to reconfigure the system as one's body is presented, a living sacrifice, holy. Paul then proclaims that it must be acceptable to God. Toni Morrison says this. She tells this story about this old lady. One day, old blind woman, is visited by some young people who seem to be bent on disproving her clairvoyance and showing her up by the fraud they believe she is. Their plan is simple. They enter her house, ask one question, the answer to which rides solely on her difference from them, a difference they regard as a profound disability. Her blindness. They stand before her. One of them says, "O woman, I hold in my hand a bird. Tell me whether it is living or dead." She does not answer, and the question is repeated. Is the bird I'm holding living or dead? She still doesn't answer. She is blind and cannot see her visitors, let alone what is in their hands. She does not know their color, their gender, or where they're from. She only knows their motive. The older woman's silence is so long the young people have trouble holding their laughter. Finally, she speaks, and her voice is soft but stern. She says, "I don't know." She says, "I don't know whether the bird you are holding is dead or alive, but what I do know that is in your hands. It's in your hands." Ultimately, we don't know what is acceptable to God. Only God knows what is acceptable to God. We think we know, but based on many of our interpretations of scripture, but hear the story told by this griot. The children thought they were doing great work as well. They wanted to prove this old blind lady was a fraud, but in retrospect, what they really was doing was being deviant. Think about them Trump supporters. Acceptability is God's work, not ours. Paul detailing that we should not allow these things of this time to warp our identity. Do not be conformed. This is instructive for what it costs to be locked in a struggle, because conformity usually is a means of yielding one's identity in order to make the empire or those in charge feel less threatened. I have had many Black women tell me they were asked to remove their PhDs and their doctorates off their office walls because other employees felt threatened because they did not have the same educational weaponry. Now, this is a play on patriarchy and heteronormative ways of being in these yet to be America that presents themselves. Think about that. You have an earned PhD and doctorate, and your counterparts come into your office and say, "Remove this." I remember a sister telling me she was the only Black staff, and they told her, we prefer you not to be called Dr. So-and-so because other people are intimidated by you. So we want you to conform to our stupidity so we can feel comfortable about your intelligence. How about that stupidity? So you have to come down so we can feel big about ourselves. And so the sister has to then decide whether she wants to keep her job or struggle with this fight the rest of her time there, or is this battle not worth fighting? See, conformity is the cost of being locked in the struggle. And the Apostle Paul is saying, do not be conformed to this time, this world. It is imperative because conformity is the prelude to death. Let me say that again. It is imperative because conformity is the prelude to death. James Baldwin reiterates it like this: what society really wants is a citizenry which simply obeys the rules of society. If a society succeeds in this, that society is about to perish. The obligation of anyone who thinks of himself or herself as responsible is to examine society and try to change it or to fight it, no matter what risk. This is the only hope society has. This is the only way society change. If, end of quote, if you don't have people who are resisting evil, that society will die. Do not be conformed. Be ye transformed, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. William Augustus Jones in God of the Ghetto says that one's theology determines one's anthropology, which determines one's sociology. So how one sees God will determine how one sees people, which will determine how one sees society. If we follow Dr. Jones' logic, then how I see God becomes the determining factor for my engagement with society. Therefore, if God, or for the sake of argument, the Messiah is a white man that ardently hates Black folks, then those who follow him would be correct in being racist and employing hatred toward Black folks. But if the Messiah is a Black man, which he is, then it rearranges everything that racists have ever said, because you lied. Because it would reinforce that Black folks were never less than human and should have never been enslaved. It shows the evilness of a country that profited off the labor of a people. And I could go on, but this is the type of transformational renewing Paul is announcing in verse 2. It is the transformation that for most registers as a social risk, because you are asking and requiring people to change ideals, patterns, and friends. Paul is unrelenting in his press for this change because it guides one to check the will of God. So I finish with this. What is the will of God? That's the question that is left on the table. And I leave with this. On December the 25th, 1956, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth was in his house with his family and two of the church members from Bethel Baptist Church, where he served, and a 16-stick dynamite blast destroyed the home and the church, which was next door, but nobody was hurt in the house. These KKK members and these white supremacists would four more times try to kill Reverend Shuttlesworth. One, because he tried to enroll his daughter into an all-white school. They stabbed him, they beat him with chains and bats. But what Reverend Shuttlesworth said was they didn't understand the call or the will of God upon my life. So I asked, if we have presented our bodies, is there some correlation with God then protecting us? I'll leave you with that to ponder. Thank you for tuning in. We'll peep you out next week. And always remember, in all you do, survive, cultivate joy, resist, and stay dope. Peace.